Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for tonight's European Movement UK webinar, for which the full title is National Identity, Britishness and Pro-Europeanism, the role of national identity in the journey back to Europe. I'm Mark English, I'm Policy and Media Advisor to European Movement UK. And before I pass over to tonight's speakers, Caroline Lucas and Professor John Denham, I just have a spot of housekeeping. You can ask your questions to the speakers in the chat from now, and we'll get to as many as we can in the Q&A session. When typing your question, if the question is for a particular speaker, please say so. We'll be bringing the questions up onto the screen during the Q&A session, which will start at around 7:05. We aim to wrap up by about 7:30, and we will try our best to keep to time as usual with these webinars. If you can't put your question in the chat for accessibility reasons, then you can email your question to events@europeanmovement, all in one word, .co.uk. Please also do be aware that this webinar is being recorded and we're streaming live right now on YouTube. And the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel from tomorrow, and we'll be sending the link round when it's ready. Before I introduce our speakers, just a word about the title, which does refer to national identity and then Britishness. We will be looking at that as a whole during the debate, but just it's likely that because for numerical reasons, the key to reversing Brexit, as we in European Movement are so keen on doing, is reclaiming English identity for the pro-European cause. That may well be the emphasis in the contributions that the speakers make, and perhaps also in the Q&A as well. So we have two wonderful speakers. I'll introduce Professor John Denham a little later, but the first speaker will be Caroline Lucas, who for most of you will need no introduction, as she is a long-standing leadership figure in the pro-European movement in the United Kingdom. She's currently the co-president of European Movement UK with Dominic Grieve as the other co-president. Caroline was MP for Brighton Pavilion from 2010 to 2024, and before that was a member of the European Parliament for over a decade. Her latest book, Another England, How to Reclaim Our National Story, I'm trying my best to show it to the camera, but perhaps it's a little blurred, which I heartily recommend, of course, asks the question, the right have hijacked Englishness, can it be reclaimed? I'm hoping very much the answer to that is yes, and over to you, Caroline, to tell us how.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you to the European Movement for the opportunity to speak tonight. I wanted to say that I'm particularly privileged to be here alongside Professor John Denham, who's been such a pioneer in the field of English identity and from whom I've learned such a lot. And I'd also like to pay tribute to the groundbreaking work of Anthony Barnett, whose book, The Lure of Greatness, is, in my view at least, one of the best books on Brexit that has been written, and it has certainly shaped my own thinking. And the case that I wanted to make tonight is essentially threefold. First, that Brexit has shone a real spotlight on just how fragile the constitutional settlement of the UK really is. I think we face a democratic as well as an economic crisis, and we need to address that. But not just that, we also face, in a sense, a kind of a cultural crisis too. And there's no route back to the EU that doesn't go through reimagining English national identity. And frankly, my third point, there's no route back either that doesn't involve acknowledging some of the mistakes the Remain side made in the referendum campaign. And we need to be very careful that we don't remake those same mistakes. So first, what is the nature of the constitutional crisis that we face? How is it related to the powerlessness that in many ways, I think, led to Brexit? Well, seen in one way, I think the problem can be rooted in our outdated political institutions, which systematically fail to give people an equal voice. So I'm thinking about our archaic and undemocratic first-past-the-post voting system, an over-centralized governance system, vast networks of patronage, and much else. But as well as this archaic governance structure, it is also about nationalisms, it is also about identity. And specifically, I would argue, how England in particular has struggled to find its way in the modern world. how many, particularly on the right, still cling to delusions of imperial grandeur and English exceptionalism, and how those to a very large extent drove Brexit. Now, in one way, it can seem like the referendum campaign was a lifetime ago. We've been through so much since, and if anything, the alienation and polarization are even greater now than they were in 2016. But the truth, I think, was clear even then, that Brexit was the result of divisions and would make those divisions worse. And in particular, I would argue that it has deepened the democratic crisis within the UK. Because the fact that England and narrowly Wales voted to leave and Scotland and Ireland to stay has put incredible strain on the myth that the UK is an equal partnership of four nations. It was the government in London who decided what form Brexit would take without any reference to the elected governments in Edinburgh or Belfast, or indeed in Cardiff. So perhaps it's no surprise that despite the travails of the SNP, support for Scottish independence remains high, or that following Brexit's role in destabilising the Northern Ireland Protocol, Sinn Féin Minister Michelle O'Neill has confidently predicted there'll be a referendum on the reunification of the island of Ireland before 2030. So the future of the UK is itself now in doubt, and indeed it's one of the many ironies of Brexit that this project, which was at least in part about the sovereignty of the UK, looks entirely likely to accelerate its breakup. Yeah, I would argue that we left the EU primarily because what happened in England. Outside of the capital, every single region of England voted for Brexit. And I think it's no disrespect to Wales, I hope, which voted by a majority of just 80,000 for leave, to say that it was an English vote that drove Brexit. Indeed, identifying as predominantly English was a stronger predictor of how likely someone was to vote for Brexit than income or social class or educational attainment. And in my efforts to try to unpack the reasons for this, in the months following the referendum, I travelled to many leave voting areas and asked people why they'd supported Brexit. And sometimes those conversations were difficult. One reason was that those who benefited most from EU membership and from the UK becoming a more open and diverse society didn't do anything like enough to share those gains fairly, and were often perceived to be sneering at those with perhaps a more traditional view of England. But those conversations were also quite refreshing because there was so much that we agreed on. And one theme that continually arose was about people's sense of pride in the places where they lived, but simultaneously their frustration over decades of neglect, their communities often hollowed out by deindustrialization, and those consequent feelings of powerlessness. And for many, I think there was a genuine sense that any change was better than the status quo, better than the grotesque levels of inequality that still persist and the powerlessness that we've been grappling with for decades. You know, I was told countless times that London and the power that was held there was so far away that it might as well have been on another planet. People felt unheard and ignored. But it was also about culture and identity. Many resented how some expressions of Englishness were allowed, while others were not. It was acceptable to love the English countryside, English humour, and to see those aspects of Englishness as welcoming and full of creativity. But the moment Englishness took a political form, it apparently turned into the opposite. The case I wanted to make is that Englishness shouldn't be seen as something to be scared of or suppressed within the notion of Britain, as if this will somehow contain it safely. On the contrary, as Brexit showed, it doesn't. I think we need to recognise that many people who see themselves primarily as English feel they are without a voice, without a political voice, because there are no institutions that represent England equivalent to those in the three other countries of the UK, nothing to give political expression to our complex and rich reality, or where differences can be expressed and hopefully resolved. And ironically, this anger with our outdated, undemocratic institutions found a lightning rod in the most remote power of all, the EU. And so when David Cameron asked people to vote in the referendum, it was seen by many as an opportunity to give a failing establishment a bloody good kicking. And unsurprisingly, a lot of people took it. So it seems to me clear that some of the lessons going forward are going to be around the need to address both that economic and democratic deficit. So yes, addressing that inequality that still persists, but also things like constitutional reform, a fairer voting system so that all votes count equally, an elected House of Lords, and ends to political patronage, the drafting of a written constitution. And alongside that, serious radical devolution, far more powers to the regions of England. And if we had more time, I think there would be a case to argue as well for an English Parliament as well. Now, that is a pretty ambitious agenda, I accept, and some of it is certainly long term. But even that isn't enough. So my second point is that we also need to reimagine national identity. And I am talking specifically about English national identity. And one of the most effective ways of doing that might well be by telling more compelling stories of who we are and who we can be, so that we might finally be a bit more comfortable in our own skin, less intent on subduing our neighbours, whether they be within the UK or across the empire. And as Mark said in his introduction, yeah, in my book, I do say that Englishness has been hijacked by the right. The dominant version of our national story tends to serve their interests, because the only people who seem to dare to speak of Englishness are cheerleaders for isolationism and imperial nostalgia. And the case I make in the book is that there are other equally compelling stories about who we are, about the English people's radical inclusivity, our ancient commitment to the natural world, our long struggle to win rights for all. And progressives need to start telling those stories and stop being so squeamish about even talking about England and Englishness, because otherwise we cede all of that territory to the right. So let's start telling those stories that put the Chartists and the Diggers in their rightful place alongside Nelson and Churchill, that draw inspiration from the suffragettes, from Tom Paine and Milton, that recognise and celebrate England's ancient multicultural heritage, that point out, for example, that when right-wing agitators are happy to use things like the Battle of Britain to promote hostility towards refugees, we might just point out that 1 in 10 RAF pilots in that battle were themselves refugees from occupied Europe. So I believe that by telling some of these stories of an England that is at ease with itself and with our past, that is forward-looking, that is open, more equal, diverse and multi-ethnic, by telling those stories and identifying the policies that can help to realise them, I think that has become a political project every bit as important as investing in infrastructure or levelling up. And I also believe that it is likely a prerequisite for rejoining the EU. I'm running out of time, so my last point very quickly was about acknowledging mistakes. I think we do need to face the fact that we let Brexit happen. Remainers let Brexit happen. It is all of our responsibilities. I know we were up against lies and misinformation and likely Russian interference too, but the fact remains that we didn't make a compelling enough case. The tone we struck was too often condescending, Project Fear too often won out over Project Hope. If we're to rejoin the EU, we need to bring Brexit voters with us. That means less arrogance, more listening. It means a more compelling case, including a more emotional case, not just trading in facts and figures, but actually telling an emotional story about who we are as a country and why our home is within that wider European Union. So I look forward to the conversation that will no doubt happen next as we explore those issues.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline, for that optimistic and inspiring vision. I think also you highlighted too the scale of the challenge when you talked about the need for people on our side to do more listening perhaps and to figure out better ways to communicate. It also struck me very much that you said we mustn't be scared of Englishness. And I think that highlights the scale of the challenge, because the very idea of being scared of Frenchness or Spanishness or even Germanness these days is really not one that kind of exists. So we're facing a difficulty that others don't have, and it is perhaps underlying Brexit itself, that particular difficulty. But you come up with a huge number of ideas which I think we do very well to listen to and to try to implement. So this brings us now to our second speaker, Professor John Denham, who is Director of the Centre for English Identity and Politics at the University of Southampton. Professor Denham was Labour MP for Southampton Itchen for 23 years, so he knows how to win elections. And he served as a minister in both the Blair and the Brown governments, including as Secretary of State, Cabinet Minister for Communities and Local Government. And John also chaired the Home Affairs Select Committee from 2003 to 2007. He writes widely on identity and England-related issues in academic publications, in the media, and also on his blog, The Optimistic Patriot, which I also heartily recommend. We could all do with more optimistic patriotism and less negative nationalism, as indeed Caroline has highlighted. And we'll put the link to John's blog in the chat. I think that's been done already. So now over to you, John.
Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. I'm delighted to be on with Caroline, and those of you who haven't read her book, go out and buy it because it's well worth reading. And I agree with pretty much everything that she said. And I'm glad that I've ended up covering some different aspects of the same challenge that we face. I was asked to give a bit more background to the Brexit decision and some reflections on where we are politically at the moment. So that's what I will do. I mean, the short version of the history is that from the early 2000s onwards, UKIP and to a considerable extent other Eurosceptics successfully mobilized a particular section of the electorate, particularly in England. When we talk about national identity, it's really important to understand that we're not talking about flags and football. National identity are the signifiers of who we regard as people like us, people with the same values, worldviews, shared histories, shared sense of place, perhaps. And the people who were mobilized, particularly by Euroscepticism, were people who emphasized their English identity. That most of them, the vast majority of them, also are very strongly British, but they emphasize their English identity. They tend to prioritize English interests. They worried that England loses out within the devolved United Kingdom, and they particularly worried about the UK state within Europe. And it's very important to understand that these voters, it's easy, rather than decrying people as wrong, bad, stupid, reactionary, as so many people did, they had a very political conception of the state. And they essentially saw the UK state as the defender of people's interests in this country, which is what made them so hostile to the idea of pooled sovereignty. At the same time, the same group of voters tend to be socially conservative. Like most people in the country, they've been steadily becoming more liberal, more progressive, more open, but nonetheless, they're the most socially conservative part of the electorate and particularly concerned about immigration. And so the disaster, in my view, and I guess most people on the call, that became Brexit was actually offering these voters a binary choice on an issue which combined the two things that they were most concerned about: national sovereignty and immigration. And hence, that's why these were the voters who turned out in the largest numbers, many of them not having voted in recent general elections at all, to vote for Brexit. So the first point to make is that we need to understand the challenge of those voters and the English emphasizers, as I will call them, as very much a political challenge around their political conception of the state and its role. So you all know what happened after Brexit, but I just want to emphasize a couple of key points. 2019 was the Get Brexit Done election. It was a victory won by the Conservatives in England. So the overall Conservative majority of Boris Johnson was 80, but that rested on an England majority of 156. So the coalition that voted Get Brexit Done in 2019 was very England and very English within England. It's interesting that although Boris Johnson won very substantially over Labour amongst people who said I'm more English than British, or people who said I'm equally English than British, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party actually won amongst that group of people who described themselves as more British than English. And really, we can understand 2024 as a shattering of the coalition that delivered Get Brexit Done. And that shattering played a bigger part in the result, frankly, than the ability of Labour or the Liberal Democrats to mobilise additional voters. Those Conservatives who didn't stay Conservative, who still prioritised issues of sovereignty and immigration, went to Reform. Those who prioritised the NHS and cost of living went primarily to Labour, or in some areas, because of the way the campaigns were fought, to the Liberal Democrats. Starmer's positioning in the run-up to 2024 enabled Labour to gain somewhat amongst some of the more socially conservative English-identifying voters, but at the cost, of course, of losing part of Labour's previous electoral base to the Green Party, to Gaza Independents, and in some areas, Liberal Democrats. So the Brexit decision was not just there in 2016, it's been working its way through politics since, and is likely to continue to do so in the role that Reform may play in the future and the choices of the Conservative Party. Now, where we are at the moment is an interesting one, because most polls show that most people think the Brexit decision was the wrong one. A majority say they would like to be back in. But it's also worth noting, isn't it, that the support for the second referendum is rather lower than either of those things. And the thing that I would point to is the extent to which underlying attitudes have not shifted. Whether we voted Remain or Leave in 2016 is still a very good predictor of the worldviews that we will have today. And those people who are most likely to vote Leave in 2016 still are much less likely to see Europe having a common culture with ourselves, of relations with European nations as being important. And I mean, I'm no insider on the Labour policy decisions, but Labour's cautiousness about reopening the issue that was that binary divide, I think probably stems from that understanding that underlying voters' attitudes have not shifted as much as some of the headline polling might suggest. So where does that leave our assessment of where we are now? Well, I think part of Labour's caution is that worry about reopening a binary divide. As an observation, this is not a storytelling government. It's a very technocratic government in its presentation. It doesn't tell big pictures about the country's position in the world, but that perhaps is what we need more than anything else. Labour will be well aware that rejoining, if it came up, would not be on old terms, and issues like freedom of movement would be even more difficult than they have been in the past. So I think you can make a case that it makes sense to approach the issue of the EU at the moment as one of a sovereign nation seeking closer links and making the case for cooperation with other nations, rather than putting rejoining or relationships with the EU per se at centre stage. And we are now working within a framework forced on us perhaps by Ukraine, by Europe's defence challenges, by climate change, where the scope for arguing the need for greater international cooperation is at least there if a government's prepared to make the argument. The other thing that I think we need to recognise, and many people on this call will have much more expertise on this issue than I do, but the EU that we left is not the same one that exists today. And I will make for this audience the controversial judgment that the referendum was 6 years after the Lisbon Treaty came into effect. 8 years later, the EU has not evolved politically in the way the Lisbon Treaty was intended to do. That was meant to bring about a further shift in the relationship between the powers of nation states towards EU institutions, and a different relationship between the citizens of Europe and the European Union institutions. Yet if you look across Europe, you can see two things. Firstly, and it's going on in France as we're talking, the politics of the nation state is actually emerging again as a key dynamic of developments within the European Union. And secondly, if you look at public attitudes, you can see that suddenly Britain, or at least England, doesn't seem to be so much of an outlier after all. Yes, we took a Brexit decision. Others are unlikely to do the similar, but all nations are seeing the rise of populist parties, primarily on the right, but also on the left. All the nations are seeing the erosion of established centre-right and centre-left political parties. All of them are showing the same demographic divides in political attitudes by education, because of mass immigration, by age, by the geographical polarization between cities and the rest of the nations. And right across Europe, surveys show that people are saying the old deal is broken. On the economy, if you play by the rules, you don't progress anymore. The government doesn't defend people like me and probably favors foreigners. That the political system doesn't represent people like me. They don't trust the media and politicians to tell the truth. So what you're actually seeing across Europe is not perhaps the European Union vision or dream that many have had, but very similar political dynamics to those that have played out in this country. So I think that we need to approach the European Union and its nations at the moment with a recognition that the nation state has not gone away in the dynamics of national politics. And it's not simply a matter of reintegrating one nation back into a Europe which is self-confident, progressive, and clearly able to deliver for its citizens. So maybe that creates the space for a United Kingdom that wants to argue that cooperation is not just the best way forward for the UK, but cooperation between nations in new ways is important for a forward-looking Europe-wide discussion.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you very much for that particularly excellent analysis, and also for challenging, I think, some of my own assumptions and the other assumptions of people who'll be listening to this event. I think it's very important that we are challenged. And I particularly noted what you said about the fact that the Get Brexit Done coalition has disintegrated and has been smashed, but that we don't have a pro-EU coalition really in any deep and meaningful way. And also that the government and others possibly who have been on the progressive side are not telling the stories that we need to tell. And I think if there is a lesson there for European movement, it's that we need to perhaps get more into telling stories and sometimes be prepared to leave behind the more statistical and factual approach. I always really hate it when people chairing events say that they're going to abuse their privileges chair and ask a couple of questions themselves, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm going to first quote something that was said by the incoming president of the European Council, Antonio Costa, yesterday, in fact, in his inaugural speech. He said, "In this globalized world, the only way to be truly patriotic, to ensure sovereignty, is to build a common Europe." And my question there is, do you think that we can get to a stage ever where a British leader could say something similar? And if we can't, does that matter? Can we still make a positive contribution to Europe without that level of, if you like, philosophical engagement? And allied to that question, a second linked one, Lisa Nandy said, to lead this country, meaning the UK, you have to like it. And what she was doing there implicitly was criticising those progressives and those on the left who have been very willing to criticise the UK and sometimes to exempt other countries from the same criticism. That also goes back to some of the things that John was saying about what's going on in Europe. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on how the pro-European side can be more positive about liking the UK and whether that might be a way that we win more hearts and minds. So the two questions, first about Costa's remark, true sovereignty is about building a common Europe, true patriotism. And the second, do we need to do more to express our own love for the UK and for its constituent parts? And that's for both speakers.
Simultaneously, or
who would like to go first?
I don't mind going first. I mean, I think that quote from Costa is an interesting one, and I like it because it speaks to the coexistence of multiple identities. We don't have to choose between different identities, and I think that kind of speaks to quite a lot of the comments that I've seen in the chat so far. That I hope I haven't been understood as kind of asking people to choose between identities. I'm simply saying that for those people who are English, recognizing that English identity is an important thing to do, as well as. So I like the quote because it speaks about coexistence of multiple identities, but I think you could kind of challenge every other kind of bit of that statement that he made, because he says, about being truly patriotic. What does that even mean? Billy Bragg, I think, had a really nice definition of patriotism where he said that patriotism is giving a shit about your country. I like that definition because it isn't saying our country is better than every other country. It's simply saying you care about it and you want it to be as good as it can be. And hence, in a sense, the popularity of Jerusalem overrule Britannia. You know, more people would like to see Jerusalem as an anthem for the country because, I'd argue, it's about making the country better. It's about giving, you know, getting your bow and your arrow and your spear and everything else, and not ceasing from mental fight until you have made the country better. So patriotism is not this kind of blind love of a country that that suggests that it's better than all other countries. It's caring about it and wanting it to be as good as it can be. So if Costa is saying you can only really love your country if you're part of the EU, I know what he means, but picking up on something that John said, the EU isn't necessarily where we might wish it to be or where we might think it's at, because I love the idea as the EU as the guarantor of our freedoms and democracy. I like the idea that you know, that it can be that. But at the last count, I think far-right parties have now entered government in around 7 European democracies, and more could easily follow. The EU is not immune to the growth of populism. And so I'd like to think of the EU as this guarantor of our rights, but it's not a given. We can't take it for granted. And then his other phrase about ensure sovereignty. Well, what does that even mean in a globalized world? You know, it was always a myth, I think, in the referendum campaign that absolute sovereignty kind of could even exist. We cede a degree of sovereignty with every trade agreement we sign, with every treaty we sign. So coming to the key point, the essential question is what could be the path to establishing the pro-European case as a patriotic one? And if that's the question, then I would argue that it is through making sure that we devolve real power to all of the component parts of the UK, in particular, because England in particular is so centralized within England, but not exclusively so. But I think it is about trying to address the powerlessness that in so many ways I think did lead to Brexit. And so I think there is a role for the European movement to campaign for the UK to become a modern democracy. And that would involve things like changing the voting system and devolving power so that we really could allow people to take back control within the UK without thinking that they need to somehow leave the EU in order to do that. Your second question about Lisa's lovely quote, to lead a country, you have to like it. I mean, I think to some extent I've already answered that within the definition that I would have of patriotism. I agree that having a kind of a sneering, you know, dismissive attitude to your country is not particularly attractive. That doesn't mean to say that you're blind to its faults, but I think it's to do with tone as well as to do with subject. And you know, I think it is important to remind ourselves there are lots of good things about our country. It's very easy to run it down, and there are very good reasons for doing so, in some senses. But yes, I think we could also recognise as well the potential that we have in this country too.
Over to you, John.
Yes, when I read that quote by Costa, my first thought, because it's obviously not aimed at a British audience, was how many of his audience in Europe actually just say, yeah, that's right. That's our view of the European Union. And my guess is the proportion of his audience that would say yes automatically that today is smaller than it was 20 years ago. And that's part of the problem you've got. It sounds like an assertion, not an argument. And I think that the EU itself needs to be able to talk in a language that recognizes the tensions between the assumptions that were made about the pooling of sovereignty and the reality of a nation state politics in many parts of Europe. And I worry if you sort of counterpose sovereignty against the European idea in that sort of way. So that's the first point. And so, you know, I think we can look at that and sort of say, well, actually, we sort of recognize some of those tensions. The second thing I'd say is that, you know, Caroline talked beautifully, so I won't do myself, about enabling England to have a national story. But my view would be that in many European countries, the right, which is often now the centre right and the populist right, tell powerful national stories, which are not necessarily positive national stories, but they are powerful. And the centre and the centre left generally doesn't like having a national story at all. And sometimes we'll talk about the European Union in place of having a national story. And that's a real problem. And it's not uncommon, leaving aside the Englishness argument, because Caroline and I are both outliers in our own parties and even thinking the issue is important. But, you know, there are lots of people, certainly in the Labour Party, who don't like talking about nation, even in the terms that Lisa Nandy talks about it. So we need, if we want to make the case for European cooperation, in most nations, we need to have a progressive story of the nation as well, which isn't the backward-looking, reactionary, exclusive story of the nation that the right tells. And too often, that debate about what does each national story consist of is going begging, because certainly the centre of the left isn't even in that discussion at all.
Well, thanks very much for those additional remarks. My only slight caveat and kind of defence of Costa would be that it's also been very noticeable how the far-right parties in European countries have had to abandon the their countries leaving the European Union stance in order to get elected. I think that's happened in France and in Italy. Only once those parties abandoned their explicitly anti-EU stance did they actually manage to get into government. So, I mean, I think there's a very complex issue around all of that. Anyway, it's now high time to bring in our audience. And I think my colleagues, Michael and Scott, are going to be bringing up the questions so that I can put them to the speakers. And the first question comes from Claire Pickardon, who asks, will the rise of the far right in Europe, for example, in Germany and in France, have an impact on their attitude to any attempt by the UK to rejoin the European Union? So perhaps Caroline first.
Well, I suppose it rather depends on who forms the government in the UK. I mean, by the time we're seriously at the stage of seeking to rejoin, and although I absolutely agree that that's the end point, and you know, there are steps along the way to doing that in terms of potentially the single market and the customs union and veterinary agreements and youth mobility schemes and all the rest of it, but that's going to take a while. So if by the time we are seeking to rejoin, you know, God forbid, we've got some kind of Farage / you know, Kemi Badenoch government, perhaps they will be more supportive of joining than not. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting what Mark was just saying about the fact that the far right in countries like Germany and France have had to abandon their anti-EU policies in order to get into power. I suspect that is a very pragmatic economic calculation, not least from having looked at what happened to the UK and thinking that, you know, cutting 4% off your GDP isn't a great start in terms of having a sustainable government. So it depends what policies, I guess, that they're promoting, and it depends what policies we're promoting.
Yeah, I think I'd say to you, Mark, that you can't say the success of the EU is measured by whether parties are advocating leaving it or not. And that is a pretty low, and I'm looking at something a bit more expansive there. The second thing is, to broaden the question, I mean, because I really don't quite know what would happen in those countries. What I suspect that people like Maloney would say at the moment was that being on the populist right doesn't seem to be any barrier to all sorts of European Union leaders coming to me and wishing to cooperate on questions of immigration and all the rest of it, and including a Labour government in the United Kingdom. So I guess it's quite complex, but it shows the difficulties that actually, you know, the visionary view of the European Union is one thing, but the European Union facing a shared migration problem is causing all sorts of political realignments that you might not have expected 5 or 10 years ago. So I think it is, the answer to Karen's question is, I'm not quite sure any of us know how this is going to play out, but I think what it does mean is that we need to focus in each of those nations on making the positive case for cooperation between European nations once again, not just simply say we have these European Union institutions that we need to belong to. This is much more fundamentally about how the peoples of Europe find ways of working together again in the face of all these enormous problems.
Thanks very much. We could, of course, do an entirely separate webinar on Maloney, and I'd actually love to. It'd be very interesting. But we'll leave that behind and move on to the next question, which is from Nigel Ryder, and it's a question specifically to John, although that doesn't mean that Caroline can't also add her views. How do you expect Trump's return to impact British attitudes to European cooperation?
I mean, can I substitute the word hope rather than expect, because my crystal ball is not that good tonight. I mean, to me, logically, Trump's return should make it easier for a government in the United Kingdom to argue in the broadest sense about cooperation with Europe. What's our place in the world, where our closest allies are likely to be? I think that those who sort of argue that somehow there's a political positioning for the United Kingdom which would enable it to be relatively unscathed under a Trump administration is actually wrong. I think the idea is a sort of a trade deal with the US. We know that would bring devastating effects for the National Health Service and for agriculture in this country. So what I hope will be the political judgment is that this actually forces us into a position of, in the broadest sense, seeing ourselves more strongly as part of Europe, not giving up, if you like, this historic rhetoric about being a bridge between Europe and US or whatever, but of seeing our hope in Europe. And I hope that those who see it that way will be able to resist those who I think have the illusion that somehow we can get a decent deal out of the Trump administration.
Caroline, would you like 30 seconds on Trump?
I think John has said it very eloquently. I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Okay, then we'll move on to the next question, which is from, suspense is killing me, from Peter Goddard. And this is a question for Caroline. Why can't the English realise that their national regional identity is far more protected within our European Union than within the UK?
Well, I would say one of the reasons that many don't realise or recognise that is because the European Union still feels too remote and distant from people's everyday lives. And as someone who's been a member of the European Parliament for 11 years, you know, I felt it on a daily basis that it was so frustrating that our media showed absolutely no interest in what was happening in the European institutions. You know, the idea that elected British politicians were making decisions on a daily basis that affected people's daily lives, whether that's the quality of the water they were drinking or the food they were eating. You know, you would never know that from the media. And in a sense, I had some sympathy with those people who felt as if the EU had been done to them rather than something that they were going along with, fully consenting to it. And you know, frankly, that's what led me to make what, in retrospect, is perhaps the biggest political mistake of my life, which was to vote in favour of the principle of having the referendum. I genuinely thought, you know, more fool me, you know, I feel that now, but I genuinely thought that it would be possible to have a constructive, serious, honest conversation about the pros and cons of EU membership, and that we could acknowledge where the European Union had undoubted democratic deficits, which it still does. I mean, let's not forget, for example, the huge powers of the Commission versus the powers of the European Parliament, even though that has been moving in the right direction. The Parliament has been gaining powers, but still it's the Commission that has the power of initiative, for example, which the Parliament does not. I genuinely thought that referendum could have been an opportunity to really bring people with us and to have that conversation, which, to be fair, never really was had after we first joined, you know, as we then, the common market became the European Union and so forth. And clearly that conversation was not an honest and direct and meaningful one. It was one that was totally hijacked. And maybe we'll come to another question that I can see is on a referendum shortly. But it makes me really worried about referenda for the future on anything, frankly, because we simply don't have enough rules, I think, for what is allowed to be claimed within those debates, and therefore the potential for actually shedding more light rather than heat.
Well, despite your eloquent mea culpa, Caroline, I can assure you that you are the last person any of us are blaming for Brexit or anything around it. John, would you like to comment on this national regional identity question?
Yeah, let me give you one answer. During the referendum, the Remain campaign ran a campaign in Scotland called Scotland Stronger in Europe. In Wales, it ran a campaign called Wales Stronger in Europe. And in England, it ran a campaign called Britain Stronger in Europe. And then you ask why people in England who felt English thought their interests were better protected when even the people who wanted to remain in the European Union weren't prepared to talk about England. Now, if you add that then to the fact that England has no government, most people say, what? No, it doesn't have a government. There is no national government of England. There's no committee of civil servants that coordinate English policy. There's no committee of ministers that coordinate policy in England. England is governed by a mishmash of what is left of the UK state after Scottish devolution. So you add all of that lack of national politics to the fact that for all sorts of historical reasons, the English have this particular attachment to a strong sovereign state. Whether we like that or not, they do. We need to enable England to find ways of expressing itself as a nation, which enables people, hopefully, to find a future. See, the final thing I say is this: every other part of the United Kingdom has had at least 2 referendum on how they wish to be governed since the turn of the century. England has never been asked how it wanted to be governed. The only opportunity that people in England have had on how they wanted to be governed was in the Brexit referendum. And what you got in Brexit was a very English response, and not a positive one from my point of view, but a very English response to finally being asked how they wanted to be governed.
That last point is an extremely interesting one that it would be great if we had time to pursue it a bit further, but I don't think we do. Let's move on to the next question. This is from David Walmsley. Is there a difference between men and women in terms of how they relate to the question of national identity? And David says he's struck by the phenomenon seen in the US and in Europe of young men in particular drifting right. Let's have John first on this.
Yeah, the answer is that there hasn't been, but some of the polling over the last 12 to 24 months has suggested that perhaps there are some identity differences. There's certainly some clear evidence of a polarization amongst young men and young women. So, for example, although the vast majority of young people didn't vote for reform, young men were about twice as likely as young women in the younger age groups to vote for reform. So I don't think it's settled down now. Most of the time I've been working on this, whenever I've looked at the gender data, almost no difference between either strength of feeling, patriotism, whatever, by gender. Maybe something is happening amongst the younger generations that we need to keep an eye on. We are an outlier at the moment in this country in having very few young people supporting the populist right. In most European countries, young people are a substantial part of the support for the populist right. It would be very silly for us either to think that that won't change or that there wouldn't be similar gender differences. So I think David's question is a very, very good one, that even if the answer is no, not very much at the moment, let's not assume that's where we'll be in 5 years' time.
I see Caroline is nodding in agreement. Do you have anything else to...
No, I think John put it very well. It is deeply concerning, I think. And as he said, we shouldn't assume it won't happen here.
Thanks very much to both of you. And the next question, please. This is from Jeffrey Thomas. Why offer a rejoin referendum? Well, I don't think anyone is yet, but hopefully at one point. Why not simply put it in a parliamentary bill as we have done with assisted dying? That's a provocative question and a good one. Caroline?
Yeah, I was just looking actually at just talking about gender. I've got a feeling that our questions haven't been terribly gender balanced, but maybe that's just my perception. Maybe more men are on this call than women.
Perhaps we could try to take a women's question next.
So why offer a rejoin referendum? I mean, I find this really hard because, I want I think if we were to rejoin the EU, we would need to be able to demonstrate that there was a settled will in the country in favour of so doing. But even as I say in the country, where do I mean? I mean, should we then, it seems to me we should have some sort of threshold so that each of the 4 nations of the UK should be in favour of it before it happens. And that was a question that was never really debated in the original referendum campaign. But then as soon as you make the rules different from the rule that we had in 2016, I can just already hear, you know, the backlash of people who still want to stay out, of saying, you know, you're changing the goalposts, so the rules should be the same. But it was certainly clear, so overwhelmingly clear, that the referendum rules were so badly thought out. The idea that there wasn't a kind of a threshold of any kind, that there wasn't any thought about what would happen if different nations of the UK decided to do different things. So although I kind of feel there should be a referendum, because I just think it's shying away from that, I think, is just an own goal, in the sense that it would mean that people were just saying you're too afraid of it and you're imposing this on us, and we would need to demonstrate that settled will, and therefore, in a sense, we should be prepared to have that referendum. I am deeply worried about, yet again, what the media will do with it, yet again, you know, what kind of thresholds we might try to add to it. I mean, why not simply put it in a parliamentary bill? I mean, we've seen how much backlash there's been to a parliamentary bill on assisted dying, in the sense of people feeling that they weren't going to have enough time to debate it. I don't think those concerns are real, but I think in terms of the pushback that we would have, I just think it would be too immense that we would be setting off on the wrong foot if we were to try to do that. Tempting though it is.
John, will we need a referendum if and when the time comes?
Well, suppose we're 2015 and David Cameron's just won his majority, and David Cameron said, I'm just going to put through a parliamentary bill to leave the European Union. Okay, if you think that would be fine, then I suppose you could go with what Jeffrey says. But I suspect people would have been quite upset by that. I mean, whether we like it or not, you know, we joined the common market through a referendum, and at the time, we forget, I'm old enough to remember, it was hugely controversial because we live in a parliamentary democracy, and a referendum didn't fit with a parliamentary democracy. And the other behind what Caroline's saying is the definition of the question, but actually these unresolved questions of what is sovereign haven't been thrashed out properly. And I don't think you can avoid having a referendum now on big constitutional change, same with Scottish independence, or if there were to be Irish reunification or something of that sort. But we do, as a nation, and you know, a lot of this discussion tonight's been about sovereignty. Maybe the European Union, maybe the European movement has a role in our own politics of actually saying, how do we want to resolve these constitutional questions? What should take priority, a referendum or a parliamentary election, and on what circumstances? Because the last, a few years ago, we had the Prime Minister lying to the Queen about the need to prorogue Parliament. She's the sovereign monarch. It's her power that is embodied in our parliament, and a prime minister was lying to the Queen. Just shows how extreme the collapse of our constitutional rules and governance has become. So I don't think you can not have a referendum, but absolutely this question goes to a central heart of our national constitutional story needs to work out much better than we have done so far, where sovereignty really lies between the people, parliament and referendum. I don't have the answers to those questions, so don't come back to me on it.
Okay, let's see if we can fit in 2 more questions, which means I need to ask the speakers to be brief. The first question is from Tesseract54, who I'm hoping is a woman in the interest of gender balance. I assume so. For both the speakers, what can the UK give to the EU? And that is a very, very good question. John, would you like to go?
I'm not sure if it still applies, but in the 1980s, I was involved in lots of work with non-government organizations on development and debt issues across Europe. And at that time, at least, we had a political culture that was often widely appreciated in the rest of the European Union in terms of being relatively pragmatic and problem solving and coalition building. Now, it may be that the antics of the last 10 years have destroyed that forever, but that seemed to me, so I don't, put ourselves forward as leading this, superpowering that, or whatever. I think there are some aspects of our culture that in the past, at least, have been valued across the European Union for making things work. And I would like to think that we could offer that in the future.
Caroline, what can the UK give to Europe?
I was just thinking about a sense of humour, actually, but that's perhaps not a very serious answer. But I do recognise and appreciate that sense of humour. Yeah, I was going to say something about, I mean, the number of times I've heard European colleagues say how much they've appreciated just the kind of the professionalism and the clarity and the pragmatism of the civil service and so forth. So I think at its best, we certainly have a lot to offer in terms of the sort of the day-to-day governance, if not the overall system. And I think there are all kinds of things that we can offer in terms of, you know, at its best. And every time one cites one thing, one can think of an alternative counter argument. But at its best, I think the UK does multiculturalism pretty well compared to many other European countries, and there's lots that could be learned from that too.
On your first point, it's amazing how many people in Belgium, where I live, can recite parts of Monty Python and Yes Minister. So certainly the sense of humour and the comedy has a role to play. Let's see if we can fit in one final question. This is from Liz Mills. Surely no need for I think this follows on from an earlier question. Surely no need for a referendum to rejoin the single market. Why not do that with a bill? Caroline.
No, I think I agree with that. I mean, we could get into deep things here with the customs union and the single market. I think actually it would be easier to rejoin the customs union without a referendum. Once you start the single market, then the single market also equals freedom of movement, which, while I'm perfectly relaxed and indeed celebrating freedom of movement, that was one of the most controversial aspects within Brexit. So I suppose if you were to try and have a bill that was essentially reopening the door to free movements, it would be quite a risky thing to do. But I would love to hear what John's going to say, because I'm not quite sure.
Well, so certainly on the customs union, I mean, Theresa May was proposing customs union, so she clearly thought that was entirely compatible with Brexit. I do agree that the single market, I think, is more complex because it has wider ramifications. So I'm not sure it would at the very least be a political judgment, and you would have to be frankly convinced that you had overwhelming support, not 52-48, before thinking you could go ahead with doing it by a bill. But maybe, you know, if we bring about a culture of cooperation that we've been talking about as the precursor to what happens in the future, then maybe attitudes would shift. But I think if at the moment you went around saying, well, all you need to do is get a bill through Parliament, that would open up all of the divisiveness all over again.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I'm sure we'd all love to continue late into the night, and I'm sure we could as well. And certainly from my point of view, I'd love to do a future webinar about the contrasting ways the relationship with Europe in terms of identity is viewed within the 27 European member states, because it's almost different in each one, I think, from the kind of France seeing itself as a leader, projecting its values through Europe, to some other countries where Europe is seen as compensating for weak national institutions. So there's a hugely varied picture there. And, you know, as the UK, we'd have to find our own probably unique path as well. So we'll end there. I'd like to say a massive thank you to both of our speakers, Professor John Denham and Caroline Lucas. I'd also like to say thank you, as ever, to Michael Anderson and Scott Daniels, my colleagues at European Movement UK, for the organisation and the superb handling of all of the logistics and preparation. And most of all, thank you to our audience for tuning in. I think you'll agree it's been a great way to end our 2024 webinar programme. Arguably, we've saved the best till last. And we look forward to seeing you in 2025, when we'll have another strong programme of webinars. And in the meantime, a happy festive season to all of you. And thanks again to everybody for taking part and for tuning in. Thank you all. Bye-bye.